There's two things that are stopping you from being able to hear God more clearly. You're either too emotional or too logical, or both. What's up? My name is Phoenix, and I can see in the spirit realm. In my journey of life and my relationship with God, with confidence, I can say that I am sure that I hear God pretty clear. And I mean that with the absolute least amount of pride possible and with absolute humility and humbleness. I'm not saying like I'm holier than anybody else or more perfect or anything. I have just talked with God all day, every day for the past long time of my life, at least the past couple years especially. But even before that, I was talking to him all the time. I just didn't fully understand yet who I was talking to. I was very fortunate enough to be raised in a very spiritually powerful Christian household where I formed an intimate relationship with God at a very young age, and it just never really went away. I grew apart from him and I was fighting him and trying to understand him, but I never really lost that connection. So with all this and with all my spiritual experiences with being able to see in the spirit realm, as is talked about in 1 Corinthians 12:10, with the ability to distinguish between spirits given by the Holy Spirit, I've had a lot of experiences where I learned that either A, my emotions were blocking me from properly understanding what I was seeing and experiencing, or my logic was. Think of it this way, okay? Everything in life is on a scale. Logic and emotion on this then. Everything is either more logical or more emotional. To properly hear God and the Holy Spirit, you want to be directly in the center, completely separate from all logic and all emotion. Now, this is really a hard thing for a lot of people to do because most people don't even realize how much they're letting their emotion or their logic block them or affect their way of thinking and what they think God is telling them or what God actually is telling them. So first off, let's talk about emotions, okay? My experience, I could tell you that a lot of times we let our emotions get in the way of what God is telling us to do because we're like, why would God tell me to do that? That doesn't make sense. Like, that's so mean. Or why would he tell me that? Like, that's not what I want to hear. Or he's telling you to tell someone something and you're like, I don't want to tell them that because that would hurt their feelings. That would destroy them. So you're letting your emotions get in the way of God when he knows better. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your path. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? It literally says the heart is deceitful above all things. Like, guys, we cannot lean on our emotions. For example, we see this in the book of Numbers when Moses strikes the rock. God told Moses to speak to the rock for water, but instead, out of anger, Moses struck it. And for this reason, he was banned from entering the promised land. In the book of Genesis, we see that Esau literally sold his birthright for like a meal because he was so hungry and he let his emotions be like taken over and just be like, oh yeah, just take my birthright, take it all. Which back then that was like a huge deal, okay? And he was just like, take my birthright so I can eat and just have a meal just because he was acting on emotion. And in doing so, he literally threw away his entire inheritance and ended up deeply regretting it. In the book of 1 Samuel, we see that King Saul offered up the burnt offering himself instead of waiting for Samuel, the seer. And in doing so, out of his fear and impatience, he ended up his kingdom was rejected by God. Once again, so there's like endless stories of this, guys. Like we see over and over again, people constantly screw up their entire lives and the will of God and his perfect plan for everything because they gave into their emotions. Now, don't get me wrong. We have emotions for a reason. There is a time and place for everything. God tells us there is a time to mourn. There is a time to party. There is a time to work. There is a time to rest. Jesus himself got sad. He wept. Jesus himself got mad and literally went in and caused a huge scene in the temple and flipped tables. So even anger, there is a time and place for it, as with all emotions. But it takes a lot of wisdom and self-control, which is the fruit of the Spirit, in order to be able to properly understand your emotions and be able to analyze your emotions outside of the emotional state and not thinking about them and acting upon them in that state of emotion. Now, on the opposite end of this, we also see a lot of people in the Bible ruin God's perfect plan for their lives and their entire lives by relying too much on their own logic and reasoning. One of the best examples of this is Sarah giving her husband Abraham their servant Hagar in the book of Genesis, because God told Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a baby. But at this point, they're both extremely old. Sarah is way beyond the age of being able to bear a child. And so they were like, well, we must have heard God wrong. So that makes no sense as to why we are going to have a baby. So maybe it's because you have to have a baby with our servant, Abraham. So he does. And they have a child named Ishmael. But then Sarah also ends up getting pregnant with Abraham's child. And they were proved, oh, we should have listened to God because he doesn't lie and what he told us is true. But instead, because of their listening to their own logic and reasoning, now there's another child, Ishmael, which we see in the Bible causes a lot of strife and issues afterwards. Whereas if they would have listened to God, that would have never happened. Even though what God told them went completely against their own logic and reasoning. We also see this in Matthew chapter 16 when Peter scoffs at Jesus for saying that he's going to die. He's like, why would the Messiah die? That makes absolutely no sense as why God would send him to literally be killed. And Jesus literally rebuked him and told him, you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Romans 8:6 says, to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is life and peace. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. Even right there, God tells us that we have to be spiritually discerned and able to understand and interpret what the Holy Spirit of God is telling us. And we see endless examples throughout the Bible of how people listening to their own logic or understanding, or relying on their own understanding, or listening to their heart and their emotions, even though they might have been well-intentioned emotions, are always led astray over and over and over again. And I say this because so many times God has told me something when I'm like, well, logically, I'm like, that makes absolutely no sense. When he'll tell me to do something, I'm like, I don't have the money for that, or that would take all of my money. That's not smart. Why would I do that? I'm not getting paid until this end, or like, but then I do it and it works out because I listen to him, and he knows he wouldn't tell me to do something if he didn't have a plan for it. He tells us that the birds don't even wonder about where their next meal is going to come from or what they're going to wear. So why would he tell me to do something when he knows that I need food? He knows that I need a place to sleep. Like, he knows that. But logically, it makes no sense for me to do these things because I'm leaning on my own logic, and God is far above that, and he can see everything and count for any conceivable thing to happen. So he knows exactly what he's doing. Or a lot of times he'll tell me to say something and I'm like, God, I don't want to say that. Like, I feel like that would hurt their emotion or hurt their feeling. Or he'll say something, tell me to do something or say something to someone, and I'm like, my anger kicks in. I'm like, why? They don't deserve that. Or like, I don't think they're not going to use that properly, or they're just going to take it for granted, or they're going to whatever, because I'm letting my own emotions get in the way. And anytime I've just listened to God on that, it always works out as well. And I see, wow, that is quite beautiful. It always turns into something beautiful. And something I've learned is that when God tells you to do things, most of the time it does not make sense. Most of the time it goes against all of our own logic and reasoning and all of our own emotional desires and wills. But once you do it in obedience and you look back on it, it always makes sense. Always, 100%, 100,000% always. And then you're like, oh, yeah, that's way better than if I would have done things based off of what I was thinking emotionally or my own logic and understanding. Because God says, literally, do not lean on your own understanding because his ways are far above us. I've said this before, but in order for God to have created time and space and like physics and everything, that means he has to exist outside of that. So a lot of times when he tells us to do things, you have to understand that he's operating from a completely different dimension, and level of understanding that we can't even begin to comprehend or fathom. So yeah, if you want to hear God clear, just start listening to him when you do hear him and seeking after him and developing that personal relationship, and learn to separate your emotions and your logic. It's hard, but you can do it. God bless you guys.